Your right side. I am, I've got most of the documents I need up on my screen. And so we'll attempt to, hopefully this will not impact the rest of you. I may be flipping back and forth between several documents. Sometimes when I do that, I just totally lose the Zoom window altogether and get a little disoriented, but hopefully that won't happen today. So welcome everybody to our first work group meeting of the new year. This is our first real meeting. I mean, a Zoom meeting. We've been doing this weird in person to person, face to face meeting stuff up till now, like it was 2019 or something, but here we go. An actual Zoom meeting. I guess I want to start off by, the last get together we had was when in the middle of December was not an official meeting because we did eventually have enough members to make quorum, but it was not till about 20 to 30 minutes in. And we had just started informal conversation at that point and just continued along those lines. So we didn't convene for a formal meeting. And we have a guest tonight or this afternoon, Alder Core, to present some thoughts on a proposal having to do with restrictive deed covenants. But, and then we have another couple of information and possible discussion items that Christy would like to present. I think I will move those up to the front of the meeting because it's always hard to carve out room at the end when we're usually midstream in discussion. But I want to give a quick preview of the meeting before we get into any of that. And, Brian is always so kind as to give us a lot of flexibility to ignore the formalities of how these meetings are supposed to go. So let me just start off with just a short preview of what we want to cover tonight or this afternoon, because we have a lot to cover. So as I mentioned, we have several informational and short discussion items at the top. And then I want to provide an update on a couple of things. I had a meeting with Mayor Connor and Alders Wood and more just the week before Christmas, I think. I want to provide an update on that. And related to that, we will be seeking an extension of the timeline for this work group. And then our main order of business is to really begin to organize our thoughts around our recommendations. And we'll do that by revisiting those categories of ideas that I had given you before. If you don't have that on hand, I'll paste the link into the chat as soon as I have a moment. But I'll be, because it's a fresh new year, I want to do a little bit of more of my talking at the beginning of that discussion to lay out a framework, which won't be new to you, but I'd like to see if we can get a little bit more of a explicit agreement around this framework before we move on. So that's what we want to cover. So let's go back now, and I'd just like to offer the floor to Alder Core at this point. So thanks for being with us today, Jennifer.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to allow me to speak. I am coming to you today because I had proposed a resolution to the City Council on Monday in regards to deed restrictions, racial deed restrictions. And I thought it was important to also bring that to this group. I had heard that you were also speaking about this as a group and kind of considering maybe some actions or kind of what to do about this issue, knowing that it's prevalent in Monona as well as other parts of Dane County and the state of Wisconsin. And so I went ahead and drafted something that's actually based on a resolution that was presented and approved by the city of Middleton back in 2019. The resolutions were very similar to theirs. And essentially the resolution just kind of calls out that this is occurring and that we denounce this existing in the city of Monona, and then encourages folks to look at options to have their own deeds amended to address this issue. I'm grateful to know that Marianne Reed had reached out to the County Register of Deeds and found out that actually there's some legislation that is potentially pending within the state of Wisconsin to address this issue. Jason was also wonderful about forwarding me some information from other states and what they've approved. So I guess more so, I want to sit back and listen and hear your thoughts and kind of find out what you've discussed and kind of what you would like to see happen. I'm open to feedback about the resolution. As I understand it, it was already forwarded to you, so you have that to look at. But really, my intent was to listen as opposed to speak on this issue.
Well, what I've found out is this is much harder than I would have thought. Christy Chabowski, the Register of Deeds, said she had heard at a conference that the Realtors Association was proposing legislation. She said, get back to me closer to the end of January to see where things go, because in the sausage making of legislation, as well as with all the partisan issues going on, she didn't know where it would be. So I have not circled back to her because I figured it was too early in the month of January. But I did go on the Wisconsin Realtors Association website to see if they were actually championing this proposed legislation. They had a lot of legislation about peers and other things that they were touting that they had either accomplished in the past year or they were looking forward to doing in the new year and so on. I couldn't find anything about some legislation that was being proposed. I did find an article, and this afternoon I sent the link to Brian to send to you guys so you could read. They did have an article on their website, and the article I brought it up on my laptop here while I'm talking about it. I mean, it talks about the history, it talks about in different states, it talks about there's a whole thing about scrubbing away the racist stains, and they kind of throw their hands up that most of things talk about that you can add something to it in other states, you can strike through it, but the actual removal of language, to quote from it, says, as far as the complete removal of objectionable language from recorded property records rather than a virtual removal or a strike through, it's unclear on how this might be done. No mechanism has yet been found to permanently remove the painful, appalling language that reminds us of our racist history. And this was written for them back last March 15th of 2021, this article. So they have an article that you can link to on their website. It has some sources in the article, but in terms of them actually advocating for legislative change, which it would seem to be something that would have to go through the state legislature to change, I don't see any evidence of that. I emailed Melissa Agar and Senator Agar and Representative Jimmy Anderson. One of Senator Agar's staffers got back to me and said, do you have an author or a bill number for this? Because I can't find anything. And I wrote back to him and I said, well, that actually was one of my 3 questions for you, is who is the author of this bill? Because in my email to them, I asked 3 questions about who is the author. Excuse me a second, and I can get it up. My 3 questions is, does the language talk about removal of the discriminatory language or merely allow the property owner to add null and void to the restrictive covenants? Or they also talked about a strike through. And who are the main sponsors? And let's see. And I also asked him if the language in this bill, which they're having a hard time finding, only had null and void, could it be changed to allow for removal of the restrictive covenant altogether? So like I said, one of Aaron Collins, one of the assistants to Senator Agard, said, you know, do you have any more information? And he said, okay, I'll keep searching and get back to you. But he hasn't gotten back to me. So I'm beginning to wonder just how sincere the Realtors Association was about this pending legislation, or whether they, you know, had this heartfelt article about, oh, this is a problem and it's hurtful and it's causing a problem, but it's going to be really hard to do something about it, and just kind of let the ball drop there in favor of some more nuts and bolts, you know, tax advantages for something or another, some of the other legislation and the piers on flowages and stuff that they were touting as their accomplishments. So I'm kind of hitting a little bit of a dead end in terms of people acknowledging just how painful it is. I did look up this afternoon the Minnesota statute that they did. And I haven't been able to digest that yet to get all the way through it. But in terms of your resolution, it might be one of the whereas that the city goes on record of asking the state legislature to put in place legislation that will enable the removal of this hurtful language from the deeds. So that, I guess, so that's my feedback on it, because it really looks like there's going to be need to be a law change, and so far I couldn't find anything that anybody is actually proposing any law change.
Marianne, thanks for those comments. I think you posed really great questions to the staffer of Melissa Agard, if that's the right office that you mentioned. We could ask, you could, or one of us could ask the Realtors Association directly. I wouldn't read too much into the fact that they don't have anything on their website, because people tend to not want to get, if they're trying to work with legislators who would have to be the principals in producing legislation and carrying the flag, people are generally very cautious about getting out in front of the legislators. So if they're trying to cultivate a champion to represent this cause, it's not surprising that they wouldn't be advertising it in advance. So I just wouldn't read too much into the fact that they don't have that kind of news publicly facing yet. You know, just recalling our past conversations, I think we saw obstacles at the that could kind of rest at the county level and the state level in terms of not being able to actually remove the language. And in the review that I did and passed on to you, I noted that California's law comes the closest in that apparently they are able to have the Register of Deeds black out the language so it can't be seen. So that's almost as the same as getting it out of there entirely, but it's not the same. Every other law I've looked at, you can still see the language. It might have a strike through in it, through it. It might have an addendum to the deed that says similar language to what Alder Core has proposed in her resolution. But California just comes the closest to making sure the language cannot be seen anymore. So there does seem to be something across the state. It's probably in state laws, but it seems to be consistent across states that says you can't take language out of a deed. You can't alter a deed that way. So that's something that people with our interests would have to explore at the state level. What is that exactly? And can it be changed at the state level, or is it somehow even untouchable at the state level to actually affect a removal, a change in the deed that would take that language out? You know, at the county level, I think about the issue of cost, that if somebody wants to modify a deed, it costs money, and that's going to be prohibitive for many people. And whether it's this at the state level or the county level, is there some kind of governmental way to subsidize the costs of doing that? Alder Cora, I wasn't sure when I read your proposal. At first, I assumed, and maybe I assumed wrong, that this was sort of slipping into a slot in between the status quo and what might be accomplished with state legislation. And you use the term repudiate. Yeah, the last whereas would have the city attorney letting folks know that they could that they could record a form of repudiation. And is that just another word for a modification, or is this a different thing that could be done, especially at no cost?
So unfortunately, what it's proposing that residents do is that it would require a cost, and it would most likely require getting a hold of an attorney and taking some financial steps to have this done. Certainly, that's not feasible for everyone, and so there's a certain level of privilege that comes with being able to do that. The state of Minnesota, when they changed their law to allow for essentially the recording of a document that says the language that's within this deed is not valid, they don't allow the removal, like you had said, but they changed their law to make it free to be able to record that, so that there isn't a cost involved. And the city of Minneapolis has a program where essentially you just fill out a form on their website to request to see if that language exists in your deed, because right now it even costs money to be able to find out whether it exists in your current deed. When I did the looking for preparing for this resolution, it cost me about $35 just to get some background information. And so the city of Minneapolis will do that for you for free if you fill out this form. And then if they do find that it exists in your deed, they will help you essentially record that formal document. But they're backlogged significantly. They've had 1,600 people apply to have this taken care of. Out of 8,000 available deeds, it's still not that many, but they've backlogged significantly because it's such an important thing for people to do, and people are interested in doing it, which is good. So unfortunately, we don't have that kind of ability to offer it free or have essentially just that one pager that's recorded, and the state of Minnesota does. But I guess my intent with this resolution was more for an educational purpose, to draw attention to it for people in the city of Winona. I think it's important for us to acknowledge that this is part of our history. And that for residents to know that this may be something that's on their own personal property deed. And, it may not be feasible for everyone, but certainly there are people in Winona who this would be feasible for, to be able to make a change to their deed. And they may actually wish to do that. But I guess my question is to you, is do we do this now? Do we want to wait until there is some state legislation? I guess I'd like your opinion on that. I did note in one of the things that I was reading that there were concerns with removing the language entirely, because there's a concern that then that wipes away essentially the stain. And does that then remove evidence of what occurred and what got us to where we are now, essentially? And so I guess I'd be interested to hear your opinion on that as well. If removing it entirely is really important, or if it's important to acknowledge it strike it through, black it out, or somehow address it within the deed, but is it important to leave it there in some way so that it's memorable enough that, you know, we understand that this is how we got to where we are and where we need to go.
So so thank you for this, and thank you for, I mean, it was an interesting document to read and contemplate given our conversations. And that very question that you just asked, I think was one that was raised. And I'll say that I feel the tension of the complete removal. I hadn't heard about this redacted idea since there's lots of redactions in other sorts of current events that we can think about. So I mean, that's an interesting idea, because I think people shouldn't have to be exposed to this language, right? And, you know, have this thing on file, right? I mean, especially if they feel targeted or if they are targeted by this. So that redaction seems an interesting idea that, you know, we haven't, I don't think we talked about it in that way in this committee. So that's an intriguing idea to me. If I could make just a couple of observations about the language and maybe a suggestion. So as we're trying to sort of, I mean, because I appreciate the educational purpose of this, you know, of what you're doing here, and I really support that. And just pivot and turn the corner, might I suggest that the last whereas, where you're giving the proposed language, that we not use the word Caucasian, right? I mean, unless we're talking about Negroids and Mongoloids, Caucasian has no place, right? I mean, we have anthropologists to thank for that. They have, you know, apologized, but that kind of language is a theory about race as a biology, and it isn't. So, you know, there might be other kinds of language that we could suggest there, and, you know, I would have some suggestions, but, you know, Caucasian doesn't have a place in any kind of documents that the city puts out. It just doesn't anymore. So yeah, so that's just an historical note. I'm wondering also, because it seems like the language in the whereas is also come right up to it and kind of imply it, but I'm wondering if I might suggest that another whereas might be inserted here around an acknowledgement that these covenants shaped, impacted, caused, I mean, some verb about the racial makeup of the city now. And I think making that connection for, you know, if it's for educational purposes, sort of closing that loop and not just sort of letting it float there, would be one thing that I would suggest. So thanks.
Thank you. Those are great, great comments. I really appreciate it. Certainly, those are easy changes to make. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, and Catherine, I'm sure you'd be willing to offer those alternatives for the terminology, if, you know, just to get in touch with Alder Corps.
Sure. I mean,
like
yeah,
that assistance.
Happy to.
I was three things, if I can get my mind together. Three things. One is the Dane County Register of Deeds is working on a database, and they're still working on it, which would help people find the covenants, restricted covenants, for free, but it isn't complete yet. The other thing is the one I have a memory, but I've been unable to lay my hands on the paper copy because I have no idea what box I put it in, was on from my mom's house. After her house was sold, they said, well, we don't use, I believe it's the abstract. And so they returned the abstract to me. But I remember being shocked that it talked about no Negro, Negress, or person of Italian extraction. So it it wasn't just for, and this was Elmhurst, corner of Wallace and Sterry in Monona. So this was, it included some Caucasians who were not white at the time that it was written. That fluid definition of passing for white. That's two of the little pieces. And I'm sorry, my mind is gone what the third one was, so that's okay.
Yeah, I had just in response to the thought about having a historical record of this kind of stain. I think it's important. I don't think individual deeds are the vehicle for that kind of historical record, because these are individual things. I mean, there is kind of a group attention to them now, but they do impact people individually and hurt at an individual level. And, a historical record is something for the community to share. It should happen at the society level. So I think that needs to be done, and it's worth doing. I don't know what the vehicle for that is, but I was thinking that that could be another part of the resolution. The fact that there will be this resolution is a historical record, but of course resolutions, they go out of sight very quickly. And I don't know what the city has, or maybe this would be something at the county level, but that could be an additional piece of the resolution to try to make sure that this incredibly hurtful stain is memorialized, if that word is ever used in the negative sense. I'm not sure. So that it does not become an invisible part of our history.
I do remember what, oh, I'm sorry, finish, Jason.
Yeah, I was just going to go back to the topic of possible legislation. We could suggest, Alder Core, that somebody else already mentioned this, that this resolution support action at the county and or state levels. I don't know, since the intent of this is mostly educational, whether you want to turn it in that direction or not, but that's certainly something you could think about.
What we've done in other similar type resolutions where we're not fixing something, it's more of an educational or a recording or opposition on something. We've essentially recorded in the resolution that we will forward this on to the state level for them to hopefully act on. And we could add a whereas that would require the city to formally send the resolution to Representative Anderson and Senator Agar's offices for them to respond to if they will, or choose to act. It would be similar to an education piece, but we're educating essentially up the chain in hopes that they would act. We could also include sending something to County Executive Parisi's office, being that the County Register of Deeds, would be able to do something as well. So even though Monona necessarily can't change very much, we could put something in our resolution to do so.
I remember what my third point was when we brought this up at the committee earlier, especially the younger members, people of color in the committee, said that their desire was to have the language removed totally, not struck through, because even seeing the language struck through raised fear, anxiety, hurt. The other thing is that when I talked with Christy Chabalski, the Register of Deeds, she talked about what she was limited in being able to do. So they can make databases searchable. They're working on a redlining map project, again, for education purpose. But she said legally, she said, I would end up in jail if I changed one word of the deed. So it has to come from a level above her. So they can add in the educational historical record part of this. But it sounds like it really has to be the state legislature that would enable language to be removed going forward. And it looked like from my first reading in Minnesota, it did talk about that when the property was sold going forward, that the language was removed at that time when the property was sold.
I hope that we provided some help to you, Alder. Is there anything else you can think of that you would like us to be thinking about as you move this through the process?
Well, you gave some absolutely excellent advice and changes. I think what my plan is, and I guess I'd like to run this plan by you, is that I would change it to then reflect a request to the county and or the state level to draft legislation that would allow redaction or removal. Complete removal would be the focus as opposed to an amendment. And then that would be the piece, hopefully, that would address some of the concerns raised here. Certainly, I will change the language in the whereas to remove the reference to Caucasian. And then I think based on these changes, I guess I feel comfortable moving this forward into the process, but if this group does not feel comfortable, I guess I'd like to know that as well. If you'd rather see another version of it, I'd be happy to bring that back once the changes are made, and then we could essentially vote on it in a February meeting. Because right now, essentially, because we had our first read Monday, it would be on our January 18th for second read and essentially approval if the council so saw it fit. But if you would like to see it come back to this group, again, prior to it going to the council for that second read, I'd be happy to postpone that. So I guess I'd like this group's opinion on that. And then I will take no more of your time.
Well, thanks for asking that question. So let me put it to the group. Is there any objection to Alder moving ahead with the revisions that she's described to us without coming back to us? This would imply that she has the support of this group of interested individuals, but not needing to have to come back to us with a revision.
Sorry, just to clarify, so your revision is the removal of the language. Okay.
Yes.
Asking that there be state legislation that would affect that kind of change. Yeah.
I guess for clarification, because currently it says the reference to the city attorney suggests that this is a course of action that a person can take now. I think I'd like to leave that in, but then also add the resolution asking for change to be made at the state level. So that's not a barrier for folks. Does that sound okay to the group, or?
It does to me.
So I'm sorry, what was that last? So
essentially right now, as the resolution stands, it just asks or suggests that people can make this change through legal means that essentially would require financial means to be able to do. I think I would leave that in, but then also add the whereas that says we're asking for changes at the state level or county level that would allow this to be essentially a much smoother process that would not require a cost and be much easier, much more accessible to folks to be able to do. Much more eloquently than I just said right now.
No, I get it. I just wanted to make sure we weren't swapping one out for the other, what that would mean. Okay, thank you.
Okay, no objections then to Alder moving ahead with this, with our blessing and those changes? All right.
Great. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for thinking of us.
Thank you.
Hello, Jerry. Good to see you. Or
hello.
I actually don't see you, but it's good to have you here. I see a big A with a squiggly bar.
Yeah, I'm just wrapping up a meeting, a doctor's appointment that I was at. I'm driving home right now, so I'm just listening in. But it was good to hear that last part. So, yep.
Great. Okay. Okay, Christy, are you feeling better or good enough?
We won't even talk about it. How about that?
All right. All right. You've got two items to tell us about, and up to you in whichever order you want to take them.
Okay, thanks so much. I'll keep things brief, but mostly for informational purposes. I wanted to let you know about a movement that has started asking for a pause on spoken land acknowledgements at meetings and events. And this is just for your information, maybe to share with your organizations and so on. The Association of Indigenous Anthropologists, they were the ones that kind of brought this to light. And they had asked the American Anthropological Association to pause. And so this is kind of caught on. And so the thoughts behind it are when these land acknowledgements started, and I'm going to speak for myself. When they started, I think a lot of us were, well, I was, it kind of felt good. We were being acknowledged, for like the first time ever, that this land was Indigenous land. And, but what's happened over time is it's just kind of become a performative statement. And the feeling, and so as of late, I would say even the last year or two, it's been uncomfortable for Natives in these meetings to hear these statements, unless the statements are followed up with some type of action, some kind of commitment to action. And so now you're going to start hearing people speak out about this, because basically when someone makes a statement like that, acknowledging that this land was stolen, and it ends there, it's akin to saying, I've stolen your car. I really like using your car. I'm going to be keeping your car, and because it works really well for me, but I'm simply acknowledging to you that I recognize that I've stolen this. And so it just rings hollow, and it's just, it's an uncomfortable situation. So just putting that out there, I shared with Jason a document and some links about these conversations, and the document has numerous resources on Natives speaking out about this. So number two was that I wanted to—
Christy, would you like Brian to distribute that to the rest of the folks?
Sure. And Brian, I'll send you, I want to send you a link. Oh, actually, I can just put it in the chat real quick. This other link that kind of talks about where this all started. Yeah, and so I think, do you have that document, Brian? With the, it has probably like 6 news sources and quotes from—
I've got the one you just put in the chat.
Okay, I'll forward you the other one as well.
Perfect, and then I'll send it out to everybody. Yep.
That'd be great. So just something to think about when you're making those statements. And then the other one is I wanted to let you know that I had asked Administrator Gadow if he thought it would be possible to fly the Ho-Chunk flag year round here in Monona, and he made that happen. So hats off to him and to all of us that get to see that there. I was at City Hall today, and it's a phenomenal feeling and sight to see that flying there along with the Wisconsin flag. I think it's a really cool thing to see in our city.
Fantastic.
Yeah. It's
wow.
Great. Yeah, it's kind of quiet, but maybe I'll write something for the paper or reach out to them to ask if they'll—
But it's just there, it doesn't matter if it's quiet or not. Wow, it's there.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah, the when the UW did that big ceremony and raised the flag, it was a little, it got fairly controversial because they only flew it for 6 hours. And, after all the elders left, they took it down. And a lot of us were feeling like, how did that harm anyone leaving it up there for even 24 hours, a month or longer? And so that was, I felt like that was it's a really good gesture for us. We're kind of leading by example there. So
Christy, can I ask,
Please do.
were any Ho-Chunk elders or someone like, Mr. Quackenbush or anything, is there a conversation? Because I thought about this before, but I also thought about how big of a deal it was for people to come together and to sort of, is flying the Ho-Chunk flag or flying a flag when you're not a member, right, of that nation. It would seem to require some consultation. So I'm just wondering if you have a story there.
Yeah, so typically our best practice here is working with the Ho-Chunk leaders that are closest to our community. And that's the folks over at Ho-Chunk Gaming Madison. So Daniel Brown, Missy Tracy. And so I actually talked with them about it and asked what they thought, and they loved the idea. They gave full blessing, and they're really thrilled about it. So yeah, thanks for asking that.
That's great to hear. Thank you.
Yeah.
And Christy, just out of curiosity, what do you know what percentage of Monona are Indigenous families, or is that any record of that?
It's really low. I saw on the census data, it looks like 2 people.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But I mean, so, I've never checked the white box. I always check American Indian on any kind of documentation. So hard to say though, if there are other people like me who do check the white box, yeah, that's a great question. I wish I knew more about that. I do know a woman who lives almost across from the high school, down a little closer to Habitat Restore, and she's Ho-Chunk, but she's also white. So those were the 2 that I know. I don't know if Ken Whitehorse lives in Monona. I think he lives in McFarland. But yeah, as far as Ho-Chunk folks in Monona, those are the only folks I know. And then lastly, I just want to throw this out really quickly is our transit commission. We have the Monona Lift, which is the bus service that it's a 24-hour call in advance and schedule a ride system. And that's mainly for differently abled people. And then we have the Monona Transit. And it's always been a challenge to work with Madison Metro because it was cost prohibitive. And even though their buses roll right down Monona Drive and Broadway, adding a stop in Monona was very costly. So there's a new director at Madison Metro. He's been there, I think, just over a year. And he really wants to see Madison Metro regionalize as much as we can. By state statute, we cannot have a regional transit authority. That was put in when Scott Walker was governor, I think 2011. So there's conversations about our transit service possibly going away and us using Madison Metro. So they're working with almost all of the other suburbs that touch Madison. So Middleton, Fitchburg, Verona, Sun Prairie, so I just wanted to throw that out to you because there are going to be potentially some inequity issues that could arise. Like for instance, we're looking at on the Plan Commission, our first affordable housing or workforce housing development on East Broadway. And that segment of the street, so Stoughton Road to Monona Drive, would not see a Madison Metro drive down that segment. So these are conversations that are, we just had our first meeting with the director of Madison Metro. The routes for Monona have not been established at all. It's just this conversation is starting to come about. So I just wanted to let you know that. So if you ever want to attend a transit meeting and hear some of those discussions, or at some point you want to chime in and encourage the Transit Commission to, ask for bus service to be on East Broadway, just letting you know and keeping you informed on that.
Christy, can you describe that stretch again that wouldn't be served?
Yeah, so the affordable housing complex is at the Chief's Auto Parts site. So it's owned by Ken Whitehorse, right across from Menards. And the Metro bus would not go, it would stop at the Park and Ride. It would go south on Stoughton Road, stopping at the Park and Ride, and then it would head back up Stoughton Road. So it would not travel on East Broadway from Stoughton Road to Monona Drive. So those folks would, if they wanted to take a bus, they would have to cross Stoughton Road at that intersection, which if you know that intersection, it would be very challenging. I don't think there's even a sidewalk that goes to Stoughton Road. It's the sidewalk, I believe, stops on the south side. It stops at the White Horse property. But I'm not sure I don't know that there's a sidewalk in front of the Unity Point Meritor. I don't believe there is. So yeah, just letting you know, we have to have these decisions made by the summer because Madison Metro is reconfiguring all their routes to kind of streamline their service. And it would mean eliminating the 4 transfer points that they have, the north, south, east, and west transfer points, so they can streamline and make their service faster. So a lot of benefits for us in joining Madison Metro, but definitely some tricky wickets in there with what do we do for our senior population that could lose the lift service, or Madison Metro service is apparently, their paratransit is kind of lacking. It's nothing like our lift service. So some issues there.
Great, thank you very much.
Absolutely, thanks for the time.
Keep us abreast of key junctures when we can say our piece. Marianne.
I just have a quick question for Christy on that last point. So there'd be no service to Ahuska Park and the farmers market then along
Correct.
there. Okay.
Correct.
Thank you.
Yep. And I really think it's something that we could put some pressure on Madison Metro because it's a significant cost for us to join up with their service. You know, I think maybe they just haven't thought about it enough, or maybe they don't know the Monona community well enough to know that that's a critical service area right there.
All right. Thanks again.
Christy, when are the transit meetings, or is that just on like the Monona website?
Let me find it for you. I believe it's January 12th. We have one coming up here next Wednesday.
Do they do it virtually as well?
Yeah, I believe all the city meetings are probably going to go virtual. Is that correct, Brian? Yeah. Yeah, it's Wednesday, January 12th at 6 p.m.
Okay.
And those will be recorded as well. And so you can always find those on YouTube on the Monona Community Media channel.
All right. I just put in the chat a link to our Google document, it's a Google sheet actually, that compilation of ideas that have come to light during our brainstorming discussions that I lumped into categories. We may probably want to take a look at that a little bit later during our discussion. So if you don't have that in front of you, that's the link right there. So a couple of updates. As I mentioned, I met with Mayor O'Connor and Alders Wood and Moore a few days before Christmas Eve. I had been talking with those 3 city leaders when I first got involved in city discussions around a response to the Furge apprehension last summer. Well, now it's 2 summers ago. And there was talk about establishing a permanent committee. That's kind of when I jumped in the conversation. So I wanted to bring them up to date on our discussions. And in short, you know, they're very supportive of our efforts, and they understand the breadth of the challenge that was given to us and the open-ended nature of exploring these issues, and they understand how hard it is to for any group to get its arms wrapped around this set of issues and figure out a concrete way forward. Unlike many city council, city groups, there is not a particular code that we are interpreting and making decisions by. This is totally open-ended territory. And there are some other city groups, perhaps like the sustainability committee that have open-ended charges too. And so some of our alders do have experience with how difficult really getting focused is. So they're very understanding of the challenge that they've given us. I did quickly give them a description of the kinds of ideas that we had talked about. They didn't blanch at anything. You know, there was nothing that struck them as being off limits or wrong-headed. They were just, they actually expressed a lot of gratitude for us looking so far and wide. I did also talk about a topic that I'm going to bring up more directly in a couple of minutes, and that is the desire for our recommendations to be tied to some specific value statements for how Monona should regard issues of equity and inclusivity and diversity, not just a recommended list of actions that the community or city government could take, but some values that it should take to heart. And there was support for that, and Alder Moore in particular, because it's related to the kind of work she does in her private practice, thought that it was important for us to tie our recommendations to values, or that it'd be very helpful, because that kind of framing of the recommendations gives the community particular focal points that can be used as standards or expectations, so that a list of recommendations just doesn't dissolve into a list of disparate pieces, but there are always these overarching statements of expectations or values that can be used to measure anything that the city does. They also understood that we would need more time. And so let me transition into that. The 6 months that we were given under original charge actually comes to a close at the end of this month. Well, the end of that's close enough for government work, as they say, the end of this month. And so we will need more time to continue. I'm really cognizant of the effort that we've the time that we've asked from each of you to participate on this, and somewhat apprehensive about letting this work go on for too long. But we all equally have a commitment and interest in finishing this work and coming up with a credible set of recommendations. And we are going to need more time. And so what I'm thinking of doing, I think a proposal to that effect should come up at the next council meeting so that it can come back to be finalized at the subsequent council meeting. And so what I think I'll recommend to the mayor is to ask for 3 more months for us. And I'm hoping we can finish in 2, but I think it'd be safer to ask for 3 more months. So if there is any comment on that, please feel free to jump in, but that's my plan in terms of what I would suggest to the mayor. We, and just jump in anytime with thoughts, but we're going to need to be really focused. I think we are all ready to really work at coming up with recommendations at this point. There will continue to be interested. I mean, we heard about several really important topics today, and it's great that there is this group that can be a focal point for issues that have to do with equity. And at the same time, so we may get additional requests for appearances. Specifically at our next meeting, what is today, the 6th, 14 plus 6 is 20. January 20th, we will have Chief Brian Cheney Austin visiting us. And that'll be a great opportunity. He is such a unique leader for our community. And it's very fortunate it'll be very fortunate for us to be able to hear from him directly. So I think I'm going to ask him to come in at the middle of our January 20th meeting. And you know, my understanding, he's a very valuable guy, and I'm sure would have no trouble presenting and discussing the issues of the day with us for the full meeting. But we do have our own work to do. So I'm going to ask him to come in the middle of our meeting, and we'll have half the meeting devoted to talking with the chief, which is, again, a great opportunity for us. But I do want to say we do need to be protective of our time going forward. All right.
Jason?
Yeah, please.
Also, talking with Raquel earlier, we were able to get some more responses after I think people realized the survey was in their spam boxes. So we were hoping to like look over those and then give kind of a quick summary regarding the Parent Equity Council for the Monona Grove School District, kind of go over those survey results with you maybe shortly in the next meeting.
Great, great. Yeah, so to fill the rest of you in, it may be clear what Jade is talking about, but on the side after our December meeting, I did meet with Jade and Raquel and talked about, asked them if they were interested in going ahead and surveying members of the Monona Grove Parent Equity Council, even in light of the fact that we had decided not to do that on a wider basis. And my hat's off to both Jade and Raquel for being enthusiastic about doing that. So that's what Jade is referring to. So we'll have that kind of input to look forward to. Thank you, Jade. All right. I'm now going to talk some more, so bear with me. What I want to do is to revisit a couple of ideas. And thanks for the comments in the chat box, folks. That's thanks for your feedback there. On the topic of value statements or something like that as part of our recommendations, I just want to represent a couple of ideas that I've talked about probably twice before. So this is not new, but I think I want to see if we're comfortable in a little bit more of an explicit way, if we're comfortable using this as a, at least tentatively, as a framework for our recommendations. And I've got two things in mind. These are the two kind of high level expectations or vision statements that have come to my mind. The first is to increase the proportion of BIPOC folks who live in Monona. That's a really simple statement, but not the kind of statement I see coming from communities very often. This is the kind of statement that a corporation might make in terms of recognizing the absolute necessity to diversify its workforce if the company is going to stay relevant and be competitive. To me, this goes beyond talk about making sure we're a welcoming community. It sort of looks towards, well, where does that get us? And how do we know if we're a welcoming community or not? I think we're going to know if we can build diversity, actual diversity in the community. And if we don't, then this welcoming stuff is sort of rhetorical. And diversity, increasing the diversity of the community is a measurable result. I'm not necessarily suggesting that we're going to set targets or anything like in an affirmative action plan, but to put that out there as a clear goal statement or vision statement is what I'm proposing. The other one has to do with cultivating the ability of African Americans and other BIPOC folks to have a full voice in representing their interests in the affairs of our community. I think no matter what our set of recommendations turns out to be, no matter what kinds of specific actions we might recommend, we're never going to know what the full package of forward-thinking, inclusive actions should be taken. That's going to depend on the changing conditions of the city as we grow. I think what we want to have in place are processes that allow BIPOC community members to really speak for themselves and be heard, and not brushed aside or not interpreted according to the way people want to interpret what they're hearing, customary ways they get interpreted. So that's the second kind of vision plank that I'm suggesting, that we want to cultivate the ability of BIPOC folks to speak for themselves in terms of the affairs of Monona, and to remove or prevent from arising any barriers to their full participation in city government life and community life. Those two taken together don't really leave out any more specific kinds of recommendations we want to make. What I'm looking for is to be able for us to be able to tie any specific recommendations to overarching values, and to have those values stick in the minds of the consumers or anybody who receives our recommendations. So I'd love to hear feedback about using those two as an overarching framework.
Jason, I just put in the chat a new acronym that's come out. It's kind of like the LGBTQ, and it's gone on and on. This might happen with DEI work, but the new acronym is DEIB, and the B being belonging, because that welcoming piece, it's welcoming is nice, but what about belonging? And so belonging is it's kind of that emotional state, of feeling like it's okay for you to be here the way you are. So maybe instead of saying welcoming, we could transition into that belonging. But I think the idea is great.
I think that's a very meaningful teasing out of that kind of wording. I like that.
Christy, could you DEIB?
Yeah, so diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging.
Okay, great. And actually that kind of goes with what I heard Jason saying, it not just being a welcoming community, to have something more.
Yes, absolutely. Because welcoming, it could be for performative, right? You welcome them.
Almost touristy.
Yeah,
it's about being nice, right? I mean,
yes, our Midwestern niceness.
Right, niceness, yeah.
Yeah, but then behind your back, it's not so nice.
So, Jason, the first thing that you mentioned about, oh my God, now it just like flew out of my head. The first value that you mentioned was what again?
Voice. A full voice for BIPOC members of the community.
No, well, increasing the proportion of BIPOC people living in Monona.
Right. Okay. That's
you said going beyond welcome.
It just flew out of my head.
Belonging. So
right. So so you made an analogy to the way that corporations talk about diversity and inclusion, because it's it impacts our bottom line. The assumption being the most important thing you can be in the United States of America is a market. Right. And so as a market, we need to market to everybody. Right. So there's a capitalistic sort of, sort of value that undergirds that, where people make the connections. I just wonder if we could think about the sort of underlying warrant, right, underneath something that says why. Right. Yeah. Because I think that there's going to be a lot of folks that would say, well, why? So what is, if it's like, we want Monona to, represent America or something like that, the certain terms of our, population numbers or, I mean, I don't know what it would be, but I just wonder if we might sort of be explicit about some warrant underneath the idea that we want Monona to be, we want more BIPOC folks living in Monona and feeling like they belong in Monona. So what's the warrant there? What's the, and I don't have an answer for that. I'm just saying if we can sort of just stick a pin in that. And I don't know if other people have ideas, but that's just something I thought about.
Well, I have more than a pin in it. I thought about that a lot, but I'm no farther along than perhaps you are. I mean, I think that's important. I would love to see that be a little section in our report, making the case for why this is good for Monona. I mean, to some small extent, there is a competitive nature in my mind to this, but I certainly don't want to carry that, the private sector value system too far into what we're interested in. But yeah, just in terms of the quality of life, being able to spell out how this improves quality of life in Monona, I think is a really important thing for us to try to do, as well as talk about if there are economic benefits, if there are workforce related benefits, those kinds of things too. But certainly there are real qualitative stuff that I'd like to be able to put into words. And so I've been thinking about that a lot, and that may be something that, if there's a small group of us who would really like to think about that together in a concentrated way, that might be really helpful.
I've been reading a lot of the a university year documentation. We did a project in like 2015, 2016 called University Year. It was a partnership with UW. It was the first of any kind. It was them partnering with Monona. And one of the terms they use over and over is dynamic. That we want, Monona needs to strive for being a dynamic community. So like being able to change, being able to evolve. And, I felt like that was a good term because, things change and you have to stay relevant. You have to stay, as we see, our entire country diversifying, we need to stay, on par with that. So I don't know if that be part of one of the words or a piece of it, but I thought that was a good term because, if we're not dynamic, then we're not going to be able to attract workforce. Our school district is going to suffer. We'll see pain points arise.
I think also under part of the why is we don't want to be cloistered off from the rest of the world. We want to fully belong to the rest of our nation and the world, and that requires that you actually fully belong to the rest of the country and the rest of the world, not by walling yourself off.
I did have a couple of concerns. For example, with this committee and also the Parent Equity Council I'm on, that unfortunately the number of BIPOC people in those committees is very low. And like these are committees specifically for our BIPOC community. So my concern is, how well, sorry, my baby's here, how well are we able to really represent BIPOC members of our community? And then, like, for example, I was talking to Raquel, and who's a great member in both of those committees, and she is really spread very thin, that she's really struggling on how do I stay in these committees, because she's also in another committee for diversity with her church. She's also a mother and with her kids, and she's on, several committees, and all these things are important to her, and her voice is important, but she just doesn't have time for this. And so I'm concerned about our community members, our BIPOC community members, how to best hear their voices, but understanding that their time is limited as well.
Absolutely. I was thinking this might be an opportunity for us to reach out to One City Schools, you know, to ask if they have any parents that they know that might be interested, or, you know, where maybe they don't live here, but some of our city committees don't have all residents. But, you know, we are drawing from a really small pool of people. I don't know if that's a possibility, but, you know, One City Schools is here for the long haul, and it's going to continue to grow. And it's, you know, we want to see that weave into the community, you know, in a nice way, not like, you know, they're in a different, you know, area, like they're like Broadway is a wall. We don't want it to be like that.
Yeah, I think I had similar thoughts, not that one specifically, but as I thought about how, you know, if we have recommendations in the area of engaging the community, we've talked about attitude change and hoping to foster community-wide attitude changes. And also we talked about this area of trying to develop the voice of people of color, and maybe doing that from the private side or the community side rather than the city government side. And so we've talked about these ideas that are challenging when you don't have critical mass in the community already. They're great because they are, well, I was going to say preventive. That's going to maybe a negative way to look at it, but they are forward thinking. They are trying to tackle issues before the issues become really negative and cumbersome. But it's hard to do when you don't have a large group in the community already that's clamoring for this change. So it's kind of a fix to me. And so I thought about, you know, maybe we need to broaden this and not think with certain kinds of recommendations. We need to try to broaden it to other communities as well, or other centers of groups of people who would be interested. Because, you know, it's not like we're facing something unique. And maybe we need to draw in parents associated with One City. Maybe we need to draw in other neighboring communities who, you know, some of them have taken a similar interest in DEIB issues recently. And so I think that is something we should keep in mind, that when we propose things, we don't necessarily, I mean, even, you know, with what Jade and Raquel are doing, they are talking with parents who are Cottage Grove parents who are part of the Parent Equity Council, not just the Monona parents there. Why not? They have the same interests that we do. So we, yeah, shouldn't get too constrained in terms of thinking that we have to stay in certain boundaries if that works against our interests.
Well, I guess, you know, the school would be also a major employer, I would assume, right? So we can sort of frame it like that as well. The one thing I'm sort of like mulling over Christy's dynamic language. And also thinking about futurity, right? And framing tasks or policies or, you know, what we do here and now around a kind of, you know, future vision, right? Which I think is not a controversial thing to say in this committee, but I think it has to do with, and this is something that I wrote about in my own research, which was on teaching intro classes. And it's like teaching to the people who are not in the room yet, but should be, right? Is something I suggest to people who are, you know, wringing their hands about, well, you know, we only attract the white people in these classes. It's only white women who sign up for, you know, women's and gender studies classes or things like that. And so to take a look at, well, who are the folks that, you know, you think would benefit from what it is you're teaching, and, you know, do more of that, right? So I don't know if this is making sense what I'm saying. I'm just saying there needs the value here. I think if we're on the conversation of values, is about thinking of the Monona of the future and who needs to be here And so it's not necessarily about, only polling people that are, somehow have some sort of connection. I mean, I think it would be really valuable to, talk to folks across, a bigger swath of the Madison area to say, so did you ever think about locating your business in Monona? Did you ever think about moving to Monona? Did you ever think, so the example of who doesn't show up and why could be super useful information, not just polling the people who are already here and then mining the few people who can speak from this experience and sort of overburden them with all sorts of committees. I mean, we can't get information about Monona outside of Monona for people who aren't really interested in showing up for us, right? Or not interested in spending their money here or living here or things like that. So to sort of expand, to think in the future, right, about who should be here, who would want to be here if we could live up to the hopes and dreams we have for our city, if that makes sense.
Good. All right. Well, feel free to get in touch with me and give me feedback on those two themes. If you have other thoughts about them, I would say at least provisionally, let's keep them in mind and hitch our recommendations. I mean, we have our possible recommendations or ideas for recommendations already grouped into categories, and I want to talk about them in a second. But again, those are kind of, that's a different level of organization. They're not value-based or particularly goal-based. And so let's use these two as value-based, goal-based pillars for the recommendations as we go forward, unless we come up with better. In our last 10 minutes, I just want to talk about the buckets a little bit. Thanks for this conversation. It's been at a general level, but for me, this is really helpful. I like feeling confident about the I don't know what to call it. Well, let me just talk about purpose, about a clear, purposeful framework for the recommendations. And I think it gets a lot easier to come up with specific recommendations and fit them in there. I feel much more confident about the impact of our recommendations when there's a clear values-based and purposeful framework for them. So I think it's time well spent, even though at the same time, I'm itching to get to the, get down on the floor and start messing around with the toys we've got scattered around on the floor. So that, I'm going to find where my copy is. So we have this list, which we'll get into next time with the first half of our meeting. And again, the chief is coming for the second half of our next meeting. I'm going to propose to do a little rearranging, and let me describe what I have in mind. Because, I'm sorry, this is a non sequitur, but when I talked with Karen a few days ago, she had a really good idea that has to do with how we present recommendations to the mayor and to the city council. And the limits has to do with the limits of what this one group is capable of. And her idea was that we could present fairly general recommendations and say that the city should follow up on those by gathering groups of people to develop implementation plans for the recommendations, so that we wouldn't feel like we've got the responsibility for how every detail of how is this going to work, who's going to do it. There are just lots of questions we don't have the time, and we don't necessarily have the expertise to answer. So that kind of speaks to the reality of how much time this kind of work takes. And so her idea is really, we turn our recommendations over to the city with recommendations for how the city should set up groups to figure out the specifics of how to move forward. And there might be as many chunks and as many groups as there are categories on this list. Does that make sense to folks? Does that sound appealing to folks? Okay.
It makes sense. I do have to back up. You talked about the next meeting that we'd talk about this for the first part of the meeting, and then Chief Cheney Austin for the second part of the meeting. How much time about the Parent Equity Council feedback? Because I'm really interested in that.
Oh yeah, right.
We don't lose that piece going forward.
That's a good point. We will make time for that. And Jade and Raquel will go over that, and we'll figure out how much time we need, because that is valuable input. You're right. I'm just, itchy to get going on this list. And most of it is going to occur, most of this list making or list calling is going to occur in our extension period, not in our original 6 months. That's a reality of it, but I just want to get going. Another thing that I'm thinking about is, but I'm not in a place to get specific about this yet. I think it'll be really helpful for those of us who are able to spend some time between work group meetings working on generating ideas for recommendations. And I'm thinking of trying to identify groups, small groups of people who would be interested in working within certain categories. And so we'll either address that, maybe we'll address that at the next meeting, or maybe I'll have something organized enough to send out between this meeting and the next meeting to get that organizational process going. But that would really help. I know people's time is really stretched thin as it is. You may not all be able to spend this kind of time, or I'm hoping we don't have to spend too much time between meetings, but maybe some of you may not even have that. But it'd be really helpful if some of us could group together and do some in-between meeting work. So just looking at these groups, in order to make that kind of work easier, I think that I should rearrange some of these groups. This is really off the top. These groupings were off the top of my head to begin with. But I'm thinking maybe I'll make some rearrangements, and I'll describe to you what they are. If you have reactions to this, we can talk about them shortly, or you can just react when I send out the rearranged groups, which I hope to do by this weekend. The third group is called Raising the Visibility of Monona's Diversity, not just through visual representations as provided by art, but also by having BIPOC folks on committees and agencies. When I came up with these categories, I was just trying to use the words that were recorded from our brainstorming sessions as faithfully as possible. I was not trying to, come up with my own interpretations. I think if we're going to chunk these ideas out, it makes sense to split apart the items that have to do with culture and having a more diverse representation of culture from those that are now in that group that have to do with representation of BIPOC individuals on city committees. I think, we're going to think about them really separately. So the ones that have to do with participation in city government, that might go up into the top category. That's about adopting city policies and practices that advance equity. Similarly, the last category, increasing access for BIPOCs, excuse the abbreviation there, to the community's material and financial resources and benefits. Almost everything on that list has to do with city policy. There is one that could be outside of city policy, and that's the one that talks about minority-owned businesses. That could be a part of city activity, but certainly a lot of that could happen outside. So at least those that are clearly about city policy, I would say throw that into the top category too. That has to do with city policies and practices that advance equity. The fourth category, help BIPOCs develop a voice that can be heard in the community, assist in connecting them to community affairs. There are many in here, not all of them, but there are many in here that reflect an interest that we've talked about in a real community-based initiative, some kind of organized network that BIPOC residents, current residents, and future incoming residents could tap into, so that increases their power to have a voice in city and community affairs. So I think it'd be great if we had a category that was clearly community-based and not city government-based. So I would propose to make that a strictly community-based category. And if there's stuff that wouldn't fit under there, we just shuffle them into some other category. So those are the kinds of changes I have in mind. It's 5 now. If you have any final comments on that, love to hear them, but also please email me with responses to that. Anybody want to provide input at this point?
Jason, it kind of looks like, just tell me if I'm following you, that you're kind of breaking it into almost 3 pots of one is a very governmental city pot, things that the city government needs to do. It looks like a culture pot or a culture thing. And then it looks like a separate community-based organization, a non-governmental citizens group pot. Am I following you correctly, or did I misunderstand you?
Yeah, you're close. Not that what I'm proposing is law in any way, but I actually was thinking of 4. So you described 3 of them. The second one that's already on the list is about attitudes and public engagement. And I think that could remain as its own category. And that could also include, this whole concern we have about ways to manage conflict. Not sure where that would end up, but that's a possible home for that too. All right. Hey, we didn't adopt any minutes tonight. Did we have minutes to adopt? Okay.
We did not, because it wasn't a formal meeting. I just have some notes from the last meeting, so we're fine.
Okay, good. All right. Yeah, I can't think of anything else. So I'd love to entertain a motion to adjourn.
I motion.
Great idea. Second?
I'll second.
Ah, wonderful. We're all of a like mind. Okay. All in favor, I assume. raise your hand.
Hi.
Thank you all. We have reached the real critical part of this